So we're back with Plus Three. We recorded our first launch episode at the Horizons after party in Brooklyn, which thankfully was well attended. Thanks for everybody who came out. It was a lot of fun. So we're gonna do a little bit of a recap from our experience at Horizons Perspectives on Psychedelics, which is held every year in New York City. You'll have any thoughts?
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I just feel
Sure.
like you're getting into that same mode where you're like, it does not sound like you're talking to a friend. Like, imagine
Okay.
you were calling, like, who's awesome? Someone awesome.
Certainly
Alexa.
none of
You're
us.
calling Alexa and you're like, yo, like, we just got back from this thing. We're going to
Cool.
go over
We'll
this,
cut it.
because I just feel like the way that you're talking right now is like super formal.
Okay.
But so yeah, I figured
Thanks
because
for
we
the
just
feedback.
started, we could easily
Sure.
try again.
So I don't want to host this thing, but
No, I think Brian should do it. I think Brian should do
just
it.
talk super casual. Hey guys,
Okay.
hey guys, welcome to the Symposia Plus 3 podcast. Or hang on,
No, but I feel like Paige should try doing it because I feel like it'll be like good to practice that.
Sure,
Okay.
say it. Yeah, just say it.
Hey, so nice to see you all again. I mean, last time we were actually in the first time of all of our conversations in the room, like together all at once, all in one place. That was super great. How are y'all feeling after Horizons in New York?
Oh, I'm still about 40 hours behind on my sleep schedule, but I figure that'll come in the next few months.
I'm all caught up. I'm good. Been getting it in.
It was definitely intense, just super packed weekend. I mean, because not only were we all together for the first time, but there's just a whole crew of folks that are assembled there and all kinds of stuff to do and different hats to wear. So it was definitely a lot, but I think it was overall pretty productive.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. We all stayed in the same apartment with one another on top of everybody. So it was a lot of fun getting to spend time with the whole team. Not on Zoom, not on a call or something like that. So it was a lot of fun.
Well, it's
Totally.
amazing how much more we get sort of done and how much more ground we covered. I felt like it was like being in an accelerator for 5 days with y'all.
For sure.
Yeah, we were also surrounded by, however many hundreds of people that were super eager to talk about not just psychedelics, but also all of these tensions, social, cultural, economic, that are really popping off. And I think it was a really good moment to sort of engage in some of those discussions, not just with ourselves, but with, all the people that were floating through.
Yeah, quite a bit of comparing notes would be my takeaway. I certainly learned a lot. There were times when, I was shocked that people we were speaking with weren't aware of some of the things that we've been chewing on for a while.
For sure.
So, I think that this year, one of the major themes in the last years, if you're sort of like in the middle of happenings, sort of kind of dividing lines have been making themselves known. And I thought that this year at Horizons, that was certainly a major theme there as far as where do people stand, on decriminalization versus medicalization. And that, I think, was one of the biggest themes this year. And, that was one of my big takeaways of where does the community really stand. And one thing about Horizons is that there are a lot of newcomers. That certainly was where I went when that was my first conference anywhere. And I think that a lot of people are going there and they don't necessarily really know what the landscape is like. And I think this year we did a very good job, especially at our table. And Dave had a lot of propaganda that he was handing out. And I think a lot of people kind of got a sense of what the biggest issues and the changes that are happening right now are.
I think it's worth pointing out that these these fracture points and lines in the sand haven't just appeared. I think, especially looking at the last year and some change, we and some other folks within the broader community have been actively working to draw those lines and asking people to give thought to where they fall on them, putting people in positions where they have to take a stand and can't just sit on the fence. And last year's Horizons was the first year that I was able to have the type of radical, anti-authoritarian, anarchist psychedelic distro at a psychedelic event, and it was hugely popular, in my opinion. I would say this year it was even more popular. I probably went through close to 1,000 zines on a variety of different topics, and people seemed really eager to engage. Whether or not they agreed entirely with them, they were really great jumping off points for conversation, which was cool to see.
Yeah, on the subject of those Z's, I mean, you were saying to people, you know, like, if you want to make a donation, but if you can't, just want to read it, go ahead. And there were so many people I saw who were super excited to be throwing dollars down for those zines, which was really, you know, nice to see.
Agreed.
I thought one of the things that was interesting is that, you know, there's a bit more general knowledge that there are for-profit private actors eagerly looking at the psychedelic space as compared to, say, the last 2 years that I'd been at Horizons or even Psychedelic Science back in 2017. This is certainly something that we've been discussing for a while privately, but I think that there was sort of an increase in the vibe, which we sort of contributed to quite a bit, being where we're focusing. But it was just interesting. It was definitely something that was on people's minds a little bit more, possibly because of that psychedelics and commercialization panel that was anticipated for Sunday.
And also, I think another kind of bellwether for this year was the fact that Reality Sandwich was, in some ways, you know, a kind of canary in the coal mine for this kind of corporate takeover. Like we haven't seen that happen in as direct a way. I think in the community, it's been mostly theoretical that this could happen, but seeing, you know, a corporate entity do a kind of back channel takeover of this. You know, we were tabled right next to Evolve for Reality Sandwich, or, you know, the Alchemist Kitchen, what would have been the Reality Sandwich table. So I think, you know, that for some people at least, that is getting it as well on their kind of the risk of it is getting on their radar.
So I think that we would need to explain a little bit more of what happened with Reality Sandwich for people who don't really know. And you're someone who's worked with them before. Can you just explain a little bit about sort of what happened there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Reality Sandwich, I got my start in the community volunteering for them, writing for them, a column. It was back in the day, you know, 10 years ago, it was the most public kind of countercultural psychedelic community wellness online magazine. And so it put out a lot of kind of think pieces and community notes and, you know, advertising events like Horizons. I did a few like conference reviews for Reality Sandwich in the early days. And so recently there's an ongoing lawsuit where this company Delic, it's affiliated with High Times magazine, has now come in and owns Reality Sandwich. And the people who were working for Reality Sandwich say that, so I wasn't working for them recently, but they say that there was a kind of back channel attempt to take it over, in the sense that the people who were working on it didn't agree to it and explicitly said, actually, like, we don't want to go in this direction, but the corporate interests found a way to take over anyway. So there's an ongoing lawsuit. We don't know how the cards will fall in the end, but it's a clear example where the community's intention for the organization didn't protect it from this kind of corporate takeover.
And there's a piece that's either out or coming soon on the Symposia site that'll discuss some of the ins and outs and experiences around that takeover.
They're literally called the Delic Psychedelic Corporation. So I just want to point that out.
I think one of the themes that I took away from this weekend was like that there is a disconnect between sort of your average person who's been following psychedelics, pushing for this renaissance to come to some conclusion. I think we've talked a little bit about how maybe we have different ideas of what that conclusion is, but I mean, I think some of the corporate actors that are moving into the space are. I think many of these people are going to be sort of faced with something of a rude awakening to see a lot of typical branding tactics being applied to sacred plant medicines, and that was something that's stuck out for me.
Yeah, and
Sure.
I think those tensions were particularly visible at the economics panel discussion.
So let's get into that. Let's get into this panel and what we all thought here. So the panel was actually called Economic Models for the Expansion of Psychedelics, and this was on the Sunday afternoon. We were all really interested specifically in this panel because of the people that were on it. So I'm just going to read the people who were on it, and then let's go through our experience and what we thought about all this. So first there was Rachel Aiden. She's the chief operations officer for Synthesis Retreat. There was George Goldsmith. He's the executive chairman, CEO and co-founder of Compass Pathways. There was Bob Jesse. He's the guy that kind of put the Hopkins crew together. He's been moving things in this space for quite a long time.
He was one of the people behind the statement on open science and open praxis.
There was Bia Labate. She runs Chacruna website. She also works with MAPS. There was Dr. James Rucker. He's a consultant psychiatrist, and he's out of King's College London, and then
works on a Compass funded study,
a group study that they're doing at King's College, and then there was Bennett Zellner. He's a professor of economics, I believe, at University of Maryland, and he's been consulting some groups in psychedelic research, like
USONA and the Mind Institute, I believe.
Right. So the way that this was really constructed, it was supposed to be like a round table, but what happened was each person got about 10 minutes to do their own presentation.
It was 8.
It was 8 minutes. Yeah. And then so each person did that, and then they got in a circle of chairs, and that was moderated by Julie Holland. She's an author, and she's a psychiatrist?
I think so.
I believe so.
Yeah.
And so she asked some questions of them, and then they opened it up for some audience questions. I think it probably doesn't make sense to do a full recap on everyone, but I think it feels important to note that the synthesis presentation that kicked it off, at least to me, didn't really feel so much like it was dealing with economic models in a broader sense, as much as it was sort of sponsored content for how synthesis is set up, why why you should come have a nice middle class experience of psilocybin truffles. That was a little disturbing to see for me, especially having just been not that long ago out to a psychedelics conference in Portland, a discussion in Seattle, and seeing the degree to which people who run retreats and other spaces and workshops for psychedelics are being able to get on stage, or being given the platform to come on stage, talk about psychedelics, but specifically talk about psychedelics through the platform of their retreat centers, their money-making enterprises, and essentially do a soft sell for their enterprises based on the merits of psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I would second the sponsored content. I mean, both the synthesis and the Compass presentations were very light on information content. for what has always been a psychedelic research forum. Horizons typically doesn't allow people who aren't some kind of a scientist to make presentations, or somebody who's at least working with data or something like that. So this was
usually in the past, like they were very strict about that, like usually requiring credentials or some like close relationship with someone choosing, but it would have been hard, I think, in past years for these kinds of talks to get through.
Yeah, so I mean, both Goldsmith and Aidan spoke a lot about their personal experiences and tried to build audience rapport by various crowd obedience kinds of exercises, and close your eyes and think about someone you love, that kind of thing. And yet, I mean, I believe Goldsmith presented exactly one slide that had words on it, other than like compass pathways. Both of them had, very slick brochure-like material, but for 8 minutes there wasn't a whole lot going on. Whereas, pair that with Bob Jesse, pair that with Zellner, and their talks were information dense. They were constructing arguments. They were taking you along, and it's just so interesting that was how these people chose to use their time.
So I completely agree on the synthesis retreat. It was extremely out of place, I felt, because really the dividing lines up there were, how are we going to fund this? That really, to me, didn't have anything really to do with more theoretical frameworks about how we're going to do this in the future. This was a fairly standard pay us money and we'll give you this higher end retreat experience. So I didn't understand what that had to do with anything. And so, I mean, Dave, I think before we get much more into this, can you just explain Compass Pathways and George and just what they're about quickly?
Sure. I think the simplest way to put it is that Compass is a for-profit corporation that's looking to offer psilocybin and other psychedelic therapies. Goldsmith has stated it's not just psychedelic, that they're looking to be a more built out sort of healthcare provider of sorts. But the thing that's really disturbing is that they appear to be working to build a vertically integrated psilocybin therapy company that essentially controls the supply from synthesis of the compound through the delivery of therapeutic sessions, and will, I would suspect, based on their current partners, include a whole bunch of AI and machine learning components in order to process patient information, reduced costs. I think the really disturbing thing for me at this point about Compass is the degree to which they present the potential for and actual instances of interference with legitimate psychedelic researchers. Perhaps go ahead.
And this was something that was brought up fairly early on on the panel. Julie speaking about asking George about Onyx and the deal that happened with Onyx. A lot of people probably aren't really familiar with that.
Well, she focused on the patent, as I recall, which came well after they had the exclusivity agreement with Onyx. The exclusivity agreement with Onyx basically meant that folks at U.S. research institutions weren't able to get GMP psilocybin. It's a particular grade that the FDA requires, good manufacturing process. They weren't able to get that psilocybin for studies that had been approved. Now, at the time that Compass did that, they didn't actually have any studies ready to go. So even if they had studies, it still would have interfered with other researchers, but perhaps they could have said, well, this is what we need right in this moment to get our researchers their materials. At that point, though, they didn't have any researchers that were ready to make use of materials. So I found that extra disturbing. But if we look at the patent, right, Julie asked Goldsmith how he could defend that patent and the concerns that other people might have about it. And my recollection was his response was along the lines of, well, we did this for the comfort of our shareholders, not because we intend on enforcing it, but because it's what they needed in order to be comfortable with us.
Well, so I actually remember that what he said, I mean, he said that as well, but I think his first response was, we have provided psilocybin to, X, Y, and Z researchers free of cost. And, the subtext to that was, well, we have provided psilocybin to the researchers that we have deemed worthy, and we chose who to give it to, and we retain that right to choose. And I just want to back up real quick because, wow, half of Rick Strassman's book on DMT, the spirit molecule, is about all of the institutional review board, like all the DEA licensing, all of the paperwork necessary to get to the point where you're gathering up your materials about to do some kind of human, patient experiment with a psychedelic medicine. And so, I'm just imagining the level of frustration that these very skilled people had put quite a bit of time and effort, getting permission from their institutions, identifying study sites, and then to be stymied at the point where, you have all of that clear, but you can't get the material due to a third-party exclusivity agreement. It's dumbfounding.
At EGA in Australia, I remember there was a talk, maybe it was the after session with researchers, but someone was talking about how each phase of their study planning had, they'd be approved to do a study by one department. They'd have a time frame within which they had to do it or initiate it. And then it's when you have the substance that you're using not available to actualize within that time frame, then you have to go back to square one and you have to start over again. So it can be a huge, spanner in the works for the whole process. And I just wanted to emphasize, because you were mentioning controlling which researchers have access, they also in the contracts say that they control what research gets published and is, in the public domain in terms of what is known about psilocybin. And so the reason that is scary is because anything that's not in the financial interest, a profit interest of Compass Pathways could be said to be, not publishable. And that's in the contracts. The researchers would not have any way to get around that.
Yeah, I mean, we're not just talking about who controls access to psychedelics, right? We're talking about who controls access to information and whether things fall into the public domain or are kept as private corporate secrets, or manipulated in ways that ultimately don't benefit humanity but benefit Compass. And one of the things I find troubling is how out of one side of his mouth, Goldsmith says, oh, we're doing this for the good of humanity. But then out of the other, if you look at all the actions, you can't engage in this sort of interference and hamstringing and, in my opinion, sort of for the benefit of Compass actions at the cost of everyone else, and say, but really we're doing this for the good of humanity.
So I want to just read briefly from this statement on open science and open praxis with psilocybin, MDMA, and similar substances, because it speaks directly to what Nishay was speaking about, and Dave, you were touching on a moment ago. And it's actually issue number 1, which is intellectual and scientific integrity. It's we affirm that we report the truth as we find it, not as we or others might prefer it to be found. We will present disappointing or adverse results as well as affirming or encouraging ones. We will properly attribute the contributions of others. And if we have this for-profit motive that, there's a lot of science being done in the private sector, but we're only going to share with you the best presentation of our product, of our service, of our protocol. This is classic pharmaceutical stuff. Or
even industries like tobacco or
sure.
Sugar, various things where the industry actors are curating the kinds of studies that are being published.
And it felt like a lot of people on the stage were getting at that. I think Julie raised some good questions. I thought Dr. Labate made some solid points, specifically talking to that giving away free drugs and comparing them to a psychiatrist or a pusher that's giving away that first taste for free. And one of the things that bothered me was the degree to which Goldsmith sort of played diplomat or political actor and talked around most of the issues that were directed at him and sort of gave non-answers or responses that didn't really meet the question, but instead talked parallel to them, which is why I was really grateful that Kevin Baltic at the end of the Q&A, I was standing probably 9 or 10 people back in line, and all of a sudden one of the Horizons volunteers grabbed me and brought me to the front, and we were informed, Yarlix and I were given the opportunity to sort of ask a final question of the panel. And I thought that her question around essentially very few folks, a lot of folks don't have access to regular therapy now. How can you stand up here and tell us that we're going to have access or equitable access to psychedelic therapy? And then my own attempt to sort of hold Goldsmith's feet to the fire and get him to answer some direct questions. I don't think he answered those questions. I don't think he really engaged with any of those questions, but I thought it was a good opportunity for folks to see the sort of responses that he had, or the fact that he's unable to address these things head on, because there is no satisfying answer, at least not to the crowd at Horizons. There are things that he can say to investors. There are things that he can say to other business people. But as far as folks that are actually concerned about legitimate psychedelic science for more than the last couple of years, and for more than developing pharmaceutical products and therapies that might be accessible to a very few, he doesn't actually have good answers for the community at large.
One thing that I realized after going there was I think that George Goldsmith was going into somewhat hostile territory, because pretty much a handful of people are aware of this, and especially the sort of insiders, the researchers have been aware of these things going on. And I felt that George's presentation was essentially kind of like a pitch to investors almost. It was very, he started immediately trying to get the crowd on his side. He told a story. He told his personal story. And he also had, Brian mentioned this before, but he told everyone to, if I recall correctly, told everyone to close their eyes and raise your hand if you know someone affected by mental health, and then open your eyes and look around, and oh my God, everyone's affected by mental health. And it was just kind of like this mind trick that he tried to play on everybody. And underneath all of that is what we've been talking about, patents and just these issues that have divided even within the research community. Under privately, these issues have really divided people within advocacy organizations. They've been quite divisive for people. Where do you stand on patents? Where do you stand on IP? So there was I don't know. I thought there was a very intentional effort for him to try to get on the side of the crowd, because if people really knew what their model really looked like, they're not for it. That was sort of my takeaway.
Yeah, I think people are, a lot of people in the space are sort of in a position that I think is default hostile and antagonistic to many of the things that are necessary for a for-profit corporation to be effective and successful, especially when, as I think pretty much everybody on the podcast has pointed out, or at one time or another, when we're talking about sort of the absurd differences between the cost of, say, GMP psilocybin and mushrooms that grow on cow patties.
Right.
I think most people have had experiences where these things are understood to be sort of all around them and relatively accessible as far as the materials themselves. And when that comes barreling into all of the barriers and interference of corporations and intellectual property and the absolute monstrosity that is the monstrous nightmare that is the American healthcare system, I think so many folks in this space have had personal experiences with healthcare issues. I mean, with mental health issues, as Goldsmith pointed out, that like they understand the importance of access and of equitable access and of low barriers to access. And I think once you actually start talking through what it takes to make some of these things happen, as far as running a successful for-profit entity in the space, most people don't want to see the logical outcomes of those structures. And by most people, I mean most people who have had a longer running interest in psychedelics, whether that's psychedelic science or more cultural and historical perspectives. Like the folks who've been around for a minute, I think, have some orientation that pits them against this.
So one thing that was funny from my perspective is that me and Brian Pace, we were sitting together, and we were sort of like the grumpy Muppets. Dave, what was their name?
Statler and Waldorf.
Yeah, that was
they're
was
my
me
spirit animal.
Well, we were sitting there, and Brian and I were sort of taking our own notes and commenting on some of this. And before the conference, we were doing, I think all of us were doing a little research on Bennett Zellner, and I told you, Dave, before, I think this guy's going to have something pretty good to offer. And so while Brian and I were sitting there, you were probably, I don't know, 50, 75 feet away. And when we spotted you, and when he gave I think when he was finished his presentation, you were applauding quite aggressively, which I pointed out to Brian Pace. So I was hoping you could say a couple things on before we wrap this up on Bennett's talk, and how, from my perspective, how refreshing that was, especially in contrast to George's presentation.
Yeah, I think
view of the future.
Look, at risk of upsetting the maybe 3 economists that might listen to this podcast, I think generally speaking, economists have really terrible imaginations. I think when you see the sort of models that get put forward for economic relations, I mean, just the whole field of economics, this notion that we can parse out this sort of material interaction from all of our social relations and everything else, it requires a sort of lack of imagination in some ways. And I tend to have a default hostile position towards folks who are economists. Happy to put that on the table. I thought Zellner's presentation was incredibly imaginative. I thought he did a really good job of pointing to the different social relations that underpin economic relations. I think he pointed really clearly to the dynamics between social institutions and relations, and the way that economics sort of exerts pressure around and on that, and that the degree to which there are feedback loops. One of the things that I was really taken with in his arguments is that there's an understanding that this economic transformation also requires social transformation, and that these are things that feed back on each other, right? So it's not just a question of how do we structure psychedelic therapy clinics, or how do we have more decentralized psychedelic therapy clinics that give local communities greater autonomy and control over them, that allow for people to meet their own needs, right? Because I think by and large, people are the best experts when it comes to satisfying their own needs. And he also pointed to the fact that in order to secure those sorts of systems and organizations, society needs to be restructured simultaneously. That these are not projects that happen one and then the other, but that if we're invested in having these alternative modes of therapy that really keep things local, that prevent the problems that occur when the folks who have investment in a particular operation are at great lengths from the locality of that operation and don't actually have to engage with the communities that are utilizing those goods and services, that suddenly things can be abstracted and we see this sort of extractivism take place. And I think what I heard by and large throughout his argument and his presentation was a call for local control, for autonomy, for self-determination, right? The notion that as much as he or other folks on stage may have had economic ideas for rolling these things out, that the implementation is going to come down to folks on the ground. And as much as we may have resources like him or other experts, at the end of the day, self-determination and communal needs should be on top of all of that. And so I think it raises really interesting questions about how can we support those sorts of structures, and how can certain types of expertise be available, but in ways that don't take charge, don't sort of force or prescribe solutions, but are rather there saying, hey, here's a bunch of information that we can provide. Sort of what are you looking for, and how can we serve as a reference point to then assist in that autonomy? And I think that's one of the most prevalent issues that I heard over the weekend around questions of access and equitability are sort of, how can you come out from outside our community and tell us what we need? We know what we need. And so I think Zellner's presentation offered at least some parts of a blueprint for what it might be to form affinity groups and work with folks who are who may have access to certain resources or knowledge bases that we don't have, but towards the end, hopefully, of establishing communal approaches that are really focused on enriching the community and taking care of folks where they live, rather than extracting wealth and exploiting people for the ongoing benefit and development of corporations and a tiny economic elite.
I saw recently that maybe we shouldn't call these people economic elite. We should be calling them predator classes, because they typically, you mentioned extractivism. They usually set things in motion. They put in a lot of capital in getting these machines going. And then as soon as things are set up, they walk away from day-to-day operations. And yet they're still taking percentages. They're still on to the next adventure, which, venture capitalism, adventure, even the whole idea of an adventurer, it was based it's based in conquest. I'm reaching to David Graeber's Debt here, where he talks about the role of the adventurer. But basically, you show up in a community, you set up some walled garden that says that this kind of activity can only happen in here and under these circumstances, and then you have to send me a check. So, I guess the thing that's so interesting as we talk about, free market approaches to psychedelics and such, is that really what a lot of the controversy that I took in from Horizons, that we spent our weekend talking about, was the fact that there are these actors that are very well funded that want to come into the space and put up barriers from other people from exercising their ability to work in it. They want to define certain people as being credentialed and able to hold these spaces for others, and then other people are remain criminals. And I think that doesn't sit well. I think that that Goldsmith and others actually had their work cut out for them, in that they were all very well versed at making pitches about what they're doing, but essentially from a very different perspective. I think that George Goldsmith has had many discussions with large groups of people where he talked about his patents in very clear terms and about how they were going to, increase the value of Compass, and they were going to absolutely prevent other people from entering the space. But confronted with people who know better and are concerned about that, he didn't really know how to engage. And I think that, ultimately, a lot of these actors are sort of looking not towards horizons for their customer base. They're looking for the people who just heard about psychedelics from Michael Pollan, who they can sell a glossy brochure to and say, "I will show you the way." Even
Horizons
though many
is a
of
nice
those people,
resume.
sure,
It's a nice portion of their resume.
yeah. Nishay, I'm curious about what you were thinking.
About what in particular?
Everything.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I just think about in an ideal situation, or the Sunshine Makers about Nick Sand and co. I just a part of that kind of sticks out when I think about the ways that psychedelic community and capitalism sometimes like don't mesh super well. And that's in the documentary. It talks about how the FBI, I think, was trying to go after these distributors and approaching it like they approach normal drug dealing and assuming that people would follow the same playbook and just kind of do as expected. And then they were totally thwarted by the fact that a lot of people were just giving this out for free. And it was based on a moral kind of like drive and conviction rather than trying to make money and just getting a quick buck. And that, ideally, if we create, enough of a platform and organizing the community, collectively, not us ourselves, but just collectively as community, I feel like there is enough kind of questioning of that normal playbook that things like, corporate takeover of Reality Sandwich, like might not work in the interest of the corporate stakeholders. So the people who think that people can just will just follow, they're used to people, following along in a certain market tested, predictable way. And ideally we can help to amplify the resisting tendencies in the community.
So one thing that Bennett pointed out that I was very happy was something that we've been discussing quite a lot is, he pointed out the underlying systemic issues. One of the things he pointed out was as wealth inequality has increased, rates of depression have increased, suicides have increased. And I thought that was quite refreshing.
Anxiety.
Yeah, I thought that was quite refreshing because if, one thing that I've said, that we've said, if we really want to tackle mental health, we necessarily have to tackle the underlying conditions, or we risk psychedelics just becoming antidepressants 2.0, treating symptoms, treating people and putting them back into the same environment that caused the harm in the first place. And I think this kind of goes to that we really need to expand the scope of our own understanding of mental health if we actually want to make an impact, or do we want to just be psychedelic cheerleaders? At the end of the day, we get our way, we are validated by the quote unquote mainstream, but we actually don't make much of an impact in this. And I thought that was, I was very happy to hear someone address that head on at the conference.
Dave, you have something to say?
Yeah, I think the flip side of that was also, it was really perhaps unsurprising, but interesting telling that Goldsmith, the part of the volley of questions that he didn't engage with at all was the question about Peter Thiel and Palantir and sort of what I would call the treadmill of suffering, right? Where
so Peter Thiel is an investor in Compass and
Arch libertarian.
Yeah, instead of us getting into the weeds, Google Peter Thiel, Google Palantir, that company, and it'll give you some context.
Totally,
Instrumental for the ice raids.
We'll probably discuss that at greater length at some point. But I just thought it was interesting that the part that he gave no acknowledgement whatsoever to was precisely that component of the question, which is to say, how can you profit off of people's traumas and then profit off of selling the cure for them, and claim that, you know, that you're doing this for human good, when you have certain actors on your team that are responsible for the very illnesses that you're claiming to cure. If you're not willing to address those components, those sources of the problem, then there's something fundamentally disingenuous going on there.
And Palantir, and Nishay, you had a very good perspective on this about Amazon employees and all that. But basically, Palantir has a variety of contracts with law enforcement agencies, with ICE. There's a Business Insider piece out that discusses the Trump administration immigration raids in Mississippi, as far as using their software to round up those people. But Nishay, you had a really good point on kind of on the psychedelic community, comparing that to Amazon workers and that.
Well, the fact that Amazon workers are organizing in protest of Amazon's association with Palantir. So when people in the psychedelic community say like, what's the big deal? Like, I don't really see a problem here. And the Amazon workers, you know, who are, you know, a range of people with different backgrounds, like the example of how striking that they think it's worth standing up against shows that, you know, it's not just a bunch of conspiracy theorists who are, you know, pushing this counter narrative, but that there's actually like problems there.
Yeah, I mean, so Amazon also is in collaboration with ICE because of their facial recognition technology, and you know, Nishay is talking about some of the protests that have been raised by both Amazon and now Whole Foods workers, and yeah, that juxtaposition with, like, you know, I thought people on the psychedelic community is pretty woke. I think we could talk a lot about that being in itself kind of an overstatement. Anyhow, but I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that I take away from this, you know, meditation on these psychedelic corporadelic actors moving into the space is the commonality between how they're trying to position themselves. Because I mean, you know, the meme that I'd like to see trend more as mushrooms grow from shit. You know, Dave was talking about it earlier. These things grow without any help, and there's this professionalization, this mystification that happens, and some of it is the result of having to interface with the FDA and getting, you know, good manufacturing practice, psilocybin, to which, you know, I understand. But the corporadelic actors, I mean, some of these people would very much like to, you know, work with the raw product, but the business model is not that great. I mean, even people who are in the underground don't tend to make $1 million, you know, selling psilocybin mushrooms in dried form. They don't keep very well. Anybody can grow them. If you can brew beer, you can probably grow mushrooms. So yeah, so I mean, I think I'm reminded of one of these old jokes where it's like, you know, a group of lions is called a pride, a group of ravens is called a murder, or crows, it's called a murder, and a group of businessmen is called a conspiracy against the public. Because I mean, you know, there's all this stuff where it's like, I mean, the World Health Organization came out and agreed that psilocybin mushrooms is the most safe recreational drug there is in terms of impacts and harms to families, impacts and harms to, you know, human physiology, and, like, you know, are there people committing crimes, and it's at the absolute bottom of all of the currently scheduled drugs. And, you know, I mean, I understand people have psychic discomfort at times, and it can be quite severe and even dangerous. But you know, given that these things have been used in festival contexts where with really minimal intervention to keep people safe, the idea that we need, you know, men in white coats, thousands of dollars to have, you know, the bare minimum standard of care is, I think, maybe a little bit ridiculous, if you ask me.
So I think that should be a wrap. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. Yeah. And if anyone wants to check out we did a live panel on the Saturday night. That episode is also going to be the episode before this.
And
so
there
check
should
that
also
out.
be some writing about the economics discussion as
Sure.
well.
We will post relevant links
Yeah,
in,
this
in
topic's
the
not
show
going
notes.
away.
Yeah,
So
this
we'll
is going to be
continue.
one of our I think main issues that we're discussing as this field gets bigger and complexifies even more. And this is what we're seeing right now is the dream of some people who have been pushing it. This is what mainstream acceptance looks like. So at least this is one facet of what that looks like. So
Thanks y'all for following along.